75 years ago today, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was founded to jointly counter Soviet expansionism. Since that day, in 1949, NATO seems to have come full circle, marking the anniversary amid deepening tensions with Vladimir Putin's Russia over its war of aggression against Ukraine. So, no birthday greetings from Moscow today. Instead, a warning. The Kremlin now sees Russia and NATO in direct confrontation. I'm Nicole Fröhlich in Berlin, and this is The Day.
The strongest, most enduring, and most successful alliance in history.
We tried to embrace Russia. Unfortunately, Russia is on the march again.
The support for Ukraine, the determination of every country represented here at NATO remains rock solid.
Relations have now slipped to the level of direct confrontation.
It could be that NATO's biggest battles and fights are still in the future.
I didn't want to spoil the birthday party for NATO.
I'm Nicole Fröhlich. Welcome to the show. Now, it's in the shadow of the war in Ukraine that NATO marks its 75th anniversary. The alliance, while bigger than ever, is also facing the biggest challenges since its inception. War on its borders and lingering questions about its future after the upcoming U.S. election. But today was a day to show unity. At a meeting in Brussels, NATO vowed to keep supporting Ukraine's fight against Russia's invasion, promising membership someday, somehow. Meanwhile, the Kremlin says its relations with NATO have reached the level of open confrontation and that there is zero communication between Moscow and the alliance.
NATO at 75, but things aren't getting any easier with age. Despite the fanfare, the alliance is facing huge challenges, from the threat posed by Russia and Ukraine and beyond to a potential second Donald Trump presidency in the United States. Trump's a NATO critic, but the alliance's head stressed the need for a united stand.
Europe needs America for its security. At the same time, North America also needs Europe.
To head off the Trump threat, Stoltenberg suggests NATO members could set up a €100 billion fund to provide a big slice of military aid to Ukraine over the next 5 years. He also says NATO should have a more direct role in delivering that aid, a change from the current setup where the US alone is largely responsible. Lithuania's foreign minister told DW that should happen, whoever the next US president is.
People are saying, that we need to take this step or this measure because of the election. I don't think that it's right, because it might breed an opposition. So I think it's best to have a different concept in mind. We do what's right. We do what is needed for NATO security. We do what's needed for Ukraine's security and Ukraine's victory.
Russia has intensified its missile attacks on Ukraine in recent weeks. With the war now into its third year, Ukraine's foreign minister says what the country really needs is more air defense systems from the West.
I don't want to spoil the party, but of course my message, the birthday party, but my main message today will be patriots, because saving Ukrainian lives, saving Ukrainian economy, saving Ukrainian cities depends on the availability of Patriots and other air defense systems in Ukraine. And we're talking about Patriots because it's the only system that can intercept ballistic missiles. Thank you.
Western allies have been hesitant on this point, but for Ukraine, that would be cause for the biggest celebration of all.
Our first guest tonight is Jim Townsend. He spent decades working on European and NATO policy at the Pentagon and NATO itself. He's now an adjunct senior fellow at the Center for a New American Security. He joins us tonight from Paris. Good to see you, Jim. Now, 75 years after the founding of NATO, is Russia once again the biggest threat?
Indeed, Russia is the biggest threat. And to deal with Russia, the alliance has to be united. And that was the main message coming out of the foreign ministers meeting. And the summit also in July is that the alliance is standing firm and the alliance is going to be getting stronger, not just in terms of numbers, but but in terms of spending and in terms of what's being bought with this money and the readiness of troops that can be increased to make sure that they can deter anything coming out of Moscow.
How much of that hangs in the balance going into the presidential elections in the U.S. come November?
Well, the U.S. election has stirred a lot of controversy here in Europe, certainly. Concerned about a Trump presidency if Joe Biden were to lose. Trump presidency that could pull the United States out of NATO, which is what Trump has said he wanted to do. There's a lot of ways he could downgrade the U.S. representation at NATO or potentially pull some U.S. forces out of NATO if that's what he decides to do. He tried to do that when he had a first term. So there's a lot that hangs in the balance with this presidential election happening in the U.S., not just with NATO, but also with Ukraine and U.S. support to Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. Russia says dialogue with NATO has reached a critical zero level. Do you believe that to be true? Are there really no remaining communication channels between NATO and Moscow?
Well, there's not the kind of communication that we've had in the past, where NATO, in fact, hosted a Russian mission or had committees where NATO met with Russia. There was quite a bit of communication. Now, if there's communication at all, it's done through a back channel. It's done through a third party. We have an ambassador, the United States does, and other allies do in Russia as well. So there's communication, but it's not quite that public communication that we've had over the past number of years since the end of the Cold War.
Mm-hmm. Now, to what degree does NATO's future depend on the outcome of the war in Ukraine?
Well, NATO's future is secure in the sense that no matter what happens, NATO is going to stay together and we're going to be a defensive alliance in support of the defense of the allies. So Ukraine is certainly a test of the alliance. Ukraine is a test of Europe as well, trying to make sure that we give Ukraine what it needs to defeat the Russians, and that the alliance is going to be part of that now, if we're going to do the fund and this type of thing. And so the future of the alliance is going to be secure. No matter what happens in Ukraine, the alliance isn't going anywhere. And that should be the message to Moscow, is the alliance is here to stay. And the alliance is here to do what it takes to make sure Ukraine is able to defend itself against Russia. So we're not going anywhere.
Mm-hmm. Even if Donald Trump returns to the White House?
Well, that's talking about the United States. In terms of NATO, NATO for sure is going to be here well into the future. And the U.S. is going to be part of NATO, too. I think even if Trump were to be elected, he might downgrade the U.S. representation. He might do some things in terms of U.S. forces in Europe. I don't see NATO necessarily leaving the alliance. I don't think Trump would do that. But Trump's, that all depends if Trump wins. This is going to be a close election. And I don't think we should assume that we're going to have a Trump presidency. I think it could very well be Joe Biden. And in the hands of Joe Biden, NATO is quite safe, as is the U.S. engagement at NATO.
All right. That was Jim Townsend at the Center for New American Security. Thank you so much for your insights.
Happy to.
And we're joined now by DW correspondents Teri Schultz, who's at the NATO headquarters in Brussels, and Miodrag Soric, who's in Riga. Our Moscow bureau moved there after Russia banned DW from reporting in the country. Hello to you both. Now, Teri, let's go to you first. What are your main takeaways from today's meeting?
Well, today, Secretary General Stoltenberg and the other allies had to strike a balance in their tone between being justifiably proud and happy that NATO has existed for 75 years, just took in two very competent new allies, Finland and Sweden, but also the serious nature of, as you heard, Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba coming here and saying, all the best, NATO, but my people are being slaughtered, our cities are being destroyed, and we really need you to come up with more air defense. So that's a difficult balance to make here. And of course, the allies know that if they don't do enough, if Russia wins this war, they themselves will be in more danger. So overall, not a very festive tone here today at NATO headquarters.
And Miodrag, the spokesman for Russian President Vladimir Putin, said today that Russia is in direct confrontation with NATO in Ukraine. What exactly did Dmitry Peskov say?
Well, as you mentioned, he said that he used this word confrontation was very aggressive. Peskov complained about NATO enlargement. He has done this many times before, and President Putin as well. As you know, Sweden and Finland joined NATO after Russia's aggression against Ukraine. It is interesting to see what Peskov is not saying. For example, that NATO is a defensive alliance, that NATO is not like Russia attacking neighboring countries. NATO provides weapons and ammunition to Ukraine so that Kiev can defend oneself. Democratic countries like Poland, Lithuania, Estonia, and so on, they've decided to join NATO to make sure that Russia is not attacking them.
Teri, have there been any comments on the statement at the meeting in Brussels?
Yeah, definitely there was attention paid to this. But, I just wanted to mention that Russia often does things like this before a NATO ministerial, any big meeting. In fact, people are expecting them to do something even bigger before the NATO summit in Washington in July. So this doesn't come as a total surprise, this comment. But I think one of the things that provoked the Kremlin to make these remarks is that NATO is talking about taking over more responsibility for delivering weapons to Ukraine from the United States. But Secretary General Stoltenberg pointed out that simply helping Ukraine defend itself, which is legal under international law, is not becoming a party to the conflict. Ukraine has the right to fight Russia, to try to kick it out of its territory, and NATO allies have the right to help Ukraine do that.
Now, Miodrag, Moscow has warned many times that sending NATO troops to Ukraine would lead to dire consequences. That is not a scenario that is on the table right now. Things as they stand, though, would Russia risk attacking a NATO member in any form?
Well, I don't have a crystal ball here right now, but as long as Biden is president in Washington, Putin will definitely not attack NATO countries. I think this is really true, and all experts agree with that. This may change when Trump is going to become the next American president. Just a couple of days ago, Putin said that Moscow has no intention to attack countries that are members of NATO. He even mentioned how much stronger American armed forces are than the Russian army, how much more money is America spending on defense. But we all remember that he also said that Russia has no intention to attack Ukraine, and we all know that he has not kept his promise. And we can see this every day when we see what's happening in Ukraine.
That was DW correspondents Miodrag Soric in Riga and Teri Schultz in Brussels. Thank you so much for all of this.
Secretary General, thank you for talking to DW on this special day, NATO's 75th birthday. A good moment to look back and to look ahead, and also to assess current challenges. So tell us, where does NATO stand today?
Well, NATO is the most successful and the strongest alliance in history because of two things. Because of our unity, that we stand together, protect each other, and because we have been able to change when the world is changing. And what we have seen over the last year is even more aggressive Russia, invading a neighbor, invading Ukraine. And therefore, since the legal annexation of Crimea back in 2014, and in particular since the full-scale invasion in 2022, NATO has stepped up when it comes to our collective defense. Allies are investing more and demonstrating that we are there to protect and defend each other, and that's actually more important than ever.
And talking about Ukraine, NATO allies have promised to support Kiev as long as it takes, but they seem not to be doing enough, because we know that the Ukrainians are running out of ammunition, that their front lines are at risk of collapsing. So is NATO about to fail Ukraine?
No, NATO allies have provided unprecedented level of military support to Ukraine. 99% of the military support to Ukraine comes from NATO allies. And this has really made a difference. We have to remember where this whole thing started back in February 2022. Most experts feared that Kiev will be taken by Russia within days and that Ukraine will collapse within weeks. What we have seen is that Ukrainians have been able to liberate 50% of the territory originally occupied by Russia. They are able to inflict heavy casualties on the Russian forces. And they have opened a corridor in the Black Sea, enabling export of grain by sinking many of the Russian ships in the Black Sea fleet. Then, of course, that's not enough. We need to do more. And that's the reason why the main message is that we need to step up and provide even more support for Ukraine. And that's urgent. And that was also the main message from the NATO ministerial meeting in Brussels this week.
But with the US debating whether to continue supporting Ukraine, and if yes, to what extent, and the Europeans clearly not able to fill the gap. So what's the plan?
The plan is to make sure that all allies, also the United States, make the necessary decisions to sustain their support to Ukraine. I cannot speak on behalf of the US Congress, but I have met several members of the Congress over the last weeks. They have all assured me that there is a big majority, clear majority, not only in the Congress, but also in the American public for more support to Ukraine. So the challenge now is to turn that majority, which is in the Congress, into a vote, into a decision. And my message to the US is that that should happen as soon as possible, because it's urgent that the US and also other allies are stepping up.
But what does it tell us about the state of the alliance when it's enough for Donald Trump to make some remarks on the campaign trail to question the US commitments to NATO to send trimmers or chills across Europe?
Well, NATO is an alliance of 32 democracies, and of course there will be different views. There will be sometimes differences between allies. We are from both sides of the Atlantic, different history, different political parties in charge. But the impressive thing with NATO is that despite these differences, we have always been able to unite around the core task of protecting and defending each other. One for all and all for one. And we do that not to provoke a conflict, but to prevent the conflict, to preserve peace, as we have done successfully so for 75 years. I expect that regardless of the outcome of the United States will remain a staunch NATO ally, because that is in the US security interest. The US is stronger with NATO than without NATO. There is a strong bipartisan support for NATO in the United States. And we have to remember that the criticism from former President Donald Trump and also from others in the United States has not been mainly against NATO. It has been against NATO allies not paying enough for NATO. And the good news is that NATO allies, including Germany and many others, are now really stepping up and investing more in defense.
And talking about paying, you have put forward a new proposal for a €100 billion fund. And this proposal, we're hearing, was met with quite controversial reactions. So is it still alive?
Well, I will not go into the specifics of what I proposed, but I have made proposals on how we can further strengthen NATO's support to Ukraine to create a more robust and institutionalized framework. So we have a more predictable long-term commitment, that we're less dependent on short-term offers, voluntary short-term offers, and more long-term commitments. What we agreed at the foreign ministerial meeting of NATO this week was to start planning. And then we will have a proposal from our military authorities, from our Supreme Allied Commander Shakur. And then based on that, I expect NATO allies to make decisions well ahead of the NATO summit in July.
After Russia's invasion of Ukraine, NATO has intensified its outreach to global partners. And yet many countries in the so-called global south are still siding with Russia and have been accusing NATO of double standards, of being dominated by the US, of being aggressive. Do they have a point?
First of all, I think it's very important that regardless of what opinion different allies or different individuals may have about the tragedy that we now see unfolding in Gaza, where there's a human catastrophe, where civilians are killed. And I welcome the efforts by many allies to try to facilitate an agreement to enable a ceasefire. regardless of what you think about that, that doesn't excuse a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. I mean, Ukraine should not be a victim of the Middle East. So, of course, I welcome a ceasefire. I support the efforts, even though NATO is not playing an active role. Some NATO allies are. But again, regardless of that, I think we need to be very clear that that doesn't give Russia any excuse of invading Ukraine, killing thousands of civilians, and continuing to use massive military force to take control. So I think it's important to stand up for the principles all over the world, but disagreements about the Middle East doesn't excuse what is a blatant violation of international law in Ukraine.
But talking about the global south, Russia is extending its footprint in some parts in Africa, for instance. So what are you doing to counter that?
Well, Russia tries in a way to of course, spread their false narrative. And of course, I believe in truth. Also, I believe that the best answer to disinformation is the truth. And the best way of ensuring that disinformation doesn't succeed is to have free, independent press to check the stories and to actually describe the reality. And of course, NATO is always ready to be part of an open public debate about the situation in Europe, in Africa, and we will continue to appeal to everyone that believes in the rule of law, that we should not allow a country like Russia to use military force to get their will.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.